Good morning, everyone. I hope you were able to attend the cocktail last night and that you've enjoyed the first day of our proceedings here. Before we start, I'm going to point out the fact that after this first presentation here, we'll split the room again like we did yesterday. The panel on sustainable public procurement will be in this room. The panel on stakeholder engagement will be in this room, and the panel on standards will be in the small room in the corridor out there. I also want to point out the fact that this CBBC produced 3 new case studies in addition to the 17 ones that already existed. The 3 new ones, you can look at them, they're on the table back there. They will also be on the website of the CBBC. One was done by Syngenta Canada. It's partnering in a pollination study in the province of Quebec. The second case study is Canadian Sphagnum Peat Moss Association, which did a research into the restoration of harvested peat bogs. And the third one is a study done for De Beers Canada, which is biodiversity policies and management at their Northern Canada diamond mines. So if you want to look at what it looks like, they're on the table back there and on the website. So I'll introduce you to our first speaker here. Is Gerard Boss. I have his bio here. Gerard Boss is the head of the Global Business and Biodiversity Program at the IUCN. He's in charge of the global, he's responsible for implementation of IUCN's business engagement strategy and serves as focal point for all businesses and biodiversity related matters at IUCN. Before joining IUCN in 2012, he worked for 5 years for Barclays Bank in London and Madrid, and for 17 years for Holcim, one of the largest building material producer in Europe, USA, and Africa. Gerard joined the Sustainable Development Team at Holcim's headquarters in 2007 and managed Holcim's relationship with IUCN, developing the biodiversity strategy for the group. He also represented Holcim at the WBCSD on the Vision 2050 and the Cement Sustainability Initiative, which is having its meeting right now in Vancouver at the same time as this meeting. Gerard has a degree in European Business Administration from the European Business School, specialized in international bank finance, and his passion for bringing different parts of society together to find optimal solutions for transformational change is what brought him to IUCN. Gerard.
Good morning, everybody. There was a lot of buzz this morning, so I see there's a lot of networking happening, and this is great. First, thanks to Braulio, David, Reg, Luc, for the kind invitation to be here and to be part of this fantastic meeting, the third one on global partnership between business and biodiversity. My title is very close to actually the title of this conference, so probably appropriate to be here with you. On the program, you actually see that it's written Gerard Boss, Netherlands. That's my nationality, but that's not the place where I work, because I work in Switzerland, in Gland, near Geneva. And one thing that you have in Switzerland is that trains are on time, and you can put your clock on the train. So I'll try to be within the time that was allocated, and gain perhaps the first 10 minutes we lost a little bit, but hopefully give your presentation also provoking some questions and discussions if I go through it fairly swiftly. I see the room is almost as full as yesterday, which is great, because very often there's a reaction of the second day having people leaving, but here you are all there. So I'm not going to ask a show of hands on who's business, who's government, who is academia and environmental organization. What I'd like to have a show of hands is who knows IUCN. Wow, that's incredible. Now, can I ask then a second question? Who is actually working with IUCN? Okay, well, I'll just have to convince half of the room then, that's okay. So I won't go too much into details in describing what IUCN does. I was also very privileged that my presentation had no title when David sent me the invitation. So I was just free to do a lot of things. And what I propose to do is to give you my reflection of the business and biodiversity progression over the last 10 years. And then see how IUCN has then developed a business engagement strategy around that. And David, if you allow me, at the last slide, I'll give some suggestions on where I think that the Global Business and Biodiversity Partnership could take us. So this is the IUCN program that was voted back in September 2012 at the last IUCN Congress, where all the members are gathering, and it has three main elements, which is our core, valuing and conserving nature. It's what's in our mission. The mission of IUCN is a just world that values and conserves nature, and that's where a lot of our knowledge products are hosted as well. The other area is the effective and equitable governance of nature's use, and we know that there is a need for governance of natural resources, not only in the protected areas, but also in the productive landscape. The third area, and that's where the Business and Biodiversity program of IUCN is housed, is deploying nature-based solutions to climate, food and development. I was last Monday at a conference on biotechnologies, and they're all talking about bio-based business and bio-based economy. But what I was failing a lot to hear during that conference, it was fantastic how much they were inspiring themselves from solutions from nature. The only problem is nobody was talking about how do we reinvest back into nature, or how do we protect some of these very fragile ecosystems that are disappearing. So there you see the word bio is used by a lot of people, but the investment back into nature and actually considering nature-based solutions is still a piece that's missing on our planet. So let me figure out how this works. Is that the right direction? Yes. IUCN is a complicated beast, but most of you know it already. Let me just remind you our setup. We've got a lot of members, and these members gives us a very privileged position because 900 of them are NGOs, environmental organizations, but another 200 are actually state members and governments, which gives IUCN since 1948 a very privileged position of influencing these two parts and actors of society. Now, I get sometimes the questions, why are companies not members of IUCN? Well, the founders didn't have that idea at the time, but clearly our engagement with business is a way of actually making sure that their voices also gets heard. I'm actually not sure that companies would like to be members of IUCN. What is happening though is we have some foundations and we have some, let's say, non-for-profit organizations closely working with business, such as the WBCSD, that have actually applied to IUCN membership. And it will be actually very interesting if that goes through and these can become then members of IUCN to represent the business community at World Congress and some of the program setting of our organization. Secretariat is about 1,000 people worldwide, represented in about 60 countries. We also have national committees, which are very important engines as well of spreading out the IUCN work and knowledge throughout the whole world. In the global programs, as I told you, the Business and Biodiversity program is with nature-based solutions alongside biomes such as forest, water, or ecosystems management or economics, which makes it very interesting because I have to interact a lot with my colleagues all the time. But the last part, and a very important part of IUCN, is our knowledge bank, our commissions. We've got access to about 11,000 volunteers and experts, and that's probably why so many hands were up there, because you might be actually members of these connections. And that's really the knowledge treasure that IUCN had, which is on a volunteering basis. So it's actually a lot of expertise, knowledge that comes into the IUCN family and in nature conservation, for which we actually don't have to pay, like actually a lot of services from nature, by the way. Some of the knowledge products that we've been developing over time, you know, the IUCN Red List of threatened species. That was, you know, that's one of our flagship products. What you might not know is that we are also developing an IUCN Red List of ecosystems, which actually talks better to business, because sometimes they've got difficulty to relate to individual species. But when you start to talk about ecosystems and ecosystem services, then the business community and the operational guys that are dealing with their interactions with the local stakeholders suddenly click and understand where the relationship can be. The other areas we've worked on the blue side is the world's database on protected areas, the protected planet, which is a very important element also for business to determine where not to go and where there is, of course, not a possibility to operate. And we are trying to push also for further no-go commitments of various industries. We've been successful with the International Councils of Metals and Mining. I'm actually next week with IPCA, which is the oil and gas industry, and I'll try to push together with UNESCO to see how far we can push them to some no-go commitments to go into World Heritage Sites. The KBAs, that's also a newer product, and you heard from Jonathan about IBAs, and I would say there's quite a lot of similarities in there. And these are basically biodiversity areas of high importance, but for the moment they need some further attention and conservation action. We don't suggest necessarily that should become protected areas, but we actually suggest that biodiversity conservation actions need to be concentrated on there. And sometimes it's actually degraded areas that need to see how we can rebuild resilient ecosystems out there. And I'll come back to that. Superimposed on these four main databases of knowledge that we have on biodiversity on our planet, and which is basically telling us on how healthy our planet is, we also are developing two new products which are much more on the locals, on the social side and on the governance side, which is the human dependencies on nature, which is to value nature's contribution to people's livelihood. And yes, it is a focus on, let's say, the poorer part of a society, which are highly dependent on natural resources. And then the overall frame in yellow, orange, whatever color you can guess from this, is the natural resources governance framework, on how do we actually get all this information linked up. Even can we actually superimpose them and have them on a spatial mapping tool so that it helps decision makers to make the right decision on how to operate in these various areas. Now, enough on IUCN. I still hope for the ones that knew IUCN, you've heard a little bit with different words explain our program. But I'd like really now to do with you is to go through this timeline of IUCN's business engagement strategy. IUCN has been engaging with business since 1948 when it was created, but it was probably on a more or less ad hoc basis. It's in 2003 that there was actually the creation officially of a business and biodiversity program. This led then at IUCN Congress in 2004 for the first presence of business. But I have to say it was pretty shy, and there was only one big company that shined or came out, but had also to react to some resistance of some of IUCN members, and it was Rio Tinto. And Rio Tinto at that time actually announced a biodiversity strategy back in 2004. Actually, some members, and on request from Council, then there was actually the willingness to understand better, well, how do we actually should be engaging with business? And that's where the first private sector strategy came out, which was helping not just IUCN Secretariat, but also the members on how to engage with business. And what I found very interesting is the slides that Jonathan showed you on BirdLife. I could have almost put the IUCN logo below it, because it's very similar, the approach we have, the due diligence that you're mentioning. We're not using the red, green and orange traffic light, but it's a very good idea, and I might be thinking about that one. In 2008 was Next Congress in Barcelona. Show of hands, who was there? Any of you in Barcelona? So you remember, there was actually a WBCSD booth in one of the pavilions. So there was actually a very visible or a visible presence of business. Not that many events that were involving business, but a few of them. And I remember some of the companies did a few side events, taking people to the cinema. That was one of the events that Holcim organized, for example. But there was a start of a good dialogue with the business community. But it was also the time that there was a motion by some of our members to say, stop the relationship with Shell. So it was interesting, there was some healthy tension out there. That motion actually didn't go through, and the part of the IUCN membership that actually rejected that motion was mainly concentrated around the state members, which is quite interesting, that it's actually the governments and the state members that say, no, we want IUCN to continue to engage with a company like Shell. 2009 is when actually the business program organized for the first time its Business Week, and had a lot of the IUCN constituencies coming together and actually trying to detail a bit better. How do we engage with business, and what do we mean when we engage with business, and how do we actually set conditions on who we should be working with and who we should not working with. And that's where the operational guidelines for the private sector engagement came up. And these rules are still applicable and used within our organization. And they have elements such as, when do we allow for sponsorship, what is the due diligence process, and how do we inform our membership in how and when we engage with business. I put on the top also the various conventions of biological diversity, and I put the ones where I was present as well, so I could really relate back to my own personal experience on that. And COP10 was an interesting one because it was the first COP I attended personally, and it was fascinating to have this one day, the Business and Biodiversity think tank, where really it was an opportunity to have a dialogue and have policymakers, but negotiators and all the various parties there in the one room. And I remember that room was packed. There were actually people standing at the back and trying to enter into the room, but it was not enough space, which was a great event. In COP11, there was still some engagement with business, but it wasn't as visible and as structured. And because I was working with IUCN by that time, I spent a lot of time in some of the negotiations, and especially some of the Aichi targets on mobilizing financial resources. And there what I heard, it was very interesting. You had all these negotiators, negotiating about a point, a comma, a word, whereas in the other rooms, business, together with the NGO community and the ones that didn't want to be in the negotiating room, discussing the actual solutions. And I actually was, making a comment publicly at one of the panels I was invited. I said, hey guys, shall we invite the negotiators to come in here, because then we can work on the solution instead of trying to write it up on a piece of paper. So hopefully 2012, and Braulio, I'm looking at you, I hope that in 2012 we will be able to connect this, but perhaps there's a lot of work for us to do in the running up to COP12 in order to get there. So IUCN Congress in 2012, so last September is actually just about a year ago, was a fascinating event. And for the ones that have been there, who was at Jeju? I know it's a bit far away, especially when you have to come all the way from North America to go there. But it was fascinating because at the entrance of the Congress, you had one huge pavilion that said business and economics. And we were in the IUCN World Congress. Who would have thought 10 years ago that you would actually have a pavilion in there that would say business and economics? And we were next to a pavilion on species, on protected planet, on marine program. And actually this pavilion served as a platform for a lot of discussions. Throughout the IUCN World Congress in Jeju, there were 80 events that were involving business people. The business representation was about 100 to 150 people, which is still a very small minority compared to the 7,000 people that were at that Congress. But at least the dialogue and the openness to actually look for solutions was really there. And I was really enthused by that event. Also, we had some very high-level executives coming from business for the Leaders Dialogue. We had the CEO of Syngenta that was there, and he stayed for 3 days at the actual event. A senior executive VP from Shell who was there, and he stayed for 2 days. And when you work with business, you know how difficult it is to mobilize the time of a CEO, a worldwide CEO, and some of the executive VPs. So that shows the commitment that some businesses have with the conservation community. 2013, and that's actually not long ago, it's just 2 weeks ago, I had Business Week in Gland, where we invited about 50 participants from IUCN. So it's actually reaching out to the various regions and the local offices for them to come and understand how we work with business. And we had 28 representatives of various companies that we work with. What we selected on purpose were the ones where we had a long-standing relationship with, because we really wanted to understand what is it that you want to get from IUCN? What kind of business and biodiversity engagement are you looking for? And this is more, or it's better and easier to do it with people that you have built trust with than just taking on new people that might be interested in working with you but don't really know you yet. So it was very interesting, and if I have time, I'm looking at my watch, I might be describing you perhaps some of the collaborative platforms that came out of that. So one slide to say a lot of things, but I think it's a good reflection on how the business and biodiversity dialogue has really started to form. And to a certain extent, I would say that the NGO community has really now found ways of interacting and working with business. Perhaps the missing party at the table are still some of the regulators and the policymakers. And I'll come back then, perhaps in my last slide, on that. But what did we learn from our engagement with business? Well, first, that incremental change is not enough, and we heard it through some of the presentations that we heard yesterday. Business as usual is not enough, and that's why there is a need to move to transformational change. But what I'd like to add is not only business as usual is not enough, but perhaps NGO as usual is not enough, and government as usual is probably not enough either. So if we want these business practices to be transformed, we really need to shape new regulatory frameworks with governments that allow for the ones that did stick their head out to actually find that they can be followed by others, or that these rules can be applied to the rest of the sector in which they took the risk of coming out beyond the others. And that's why we need to leverage greater change by influencing across sectors and along the whole supply chain. And it was great to hear yesterday so many examples that we're actually focusing and showing these examples that are happening along the whole supply chain, so influence your customers and your suppliers, and actually looking at collaborations between sectors as well, and seeing how one waste product of one company becomes the raw material of the other, because then you have really a saving on the natural resources that are being used. But one other item that we really learned from working with business for 10 years is that the most contentious issue that still remains is the impact on natural resources dependent livelihoods. Business is great at focusing at their own operational and looking at what they can do, which is closely in their control. But when you start asking them to look beyond the fences, it becomes a bit more difficult. And when you ask them to really take into consideration the natural resources dependent livelihoods on which they don't have that much influence, but they do impact a lot, then the discussions sometimes become a bit more difficult. But that's really the new era of interactions and conservation actions we need to go into. And the last point, which I made when I was talking about the IUCN program and the example of the bio-based economy, there is an urgent need to invest in nature-based solutions and key biodiversity areas. Because if we don't do that, we won't have a planet to benefit from for the next years. And there was one of the speakers that said, well, the human civilization it's a blip on the planet's evolution. But if we want that blip to be just a little bit longer, then probably we should make sure that we do invest in nature not too late. The business engagement strategy of IUCN is this circle, where we are seeking for transformational change, and that transformational change is really to integrate biodiversity and natural resources dependent livelihoods into the business decisions. Make business think at the landscape level than just at an operational level. That's what IUCN stands for. And we propose to do that in 3 different ways. Either we work on direct impacts, and that's where IUCN has worked a lot with large footprint companies, the extractive, the oil and gas, mining, but we've asked them to look beyond their own boundaries and to also, whatever we do with them, that we can spread that at the sector level, so that it's not a proprietary information they keep for themselves, but they can actually spread out and have the whole sector benefiting from the work that was done jointly. The second area is leveraging on supply chain. We talked about it. How can you make sure that you don't influence just one company, but actually the whole value chain? And one example that we've got of that is the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, where we've actually joined up 13 different companies probably that were never together in one room, to actually discuss on what would be the ideal sustainable standard for aluminium, all the way from bauxite mining to the transformation, but the use of a product, and more importantly also the reuse of it. Because aluminium has one feature: it can be recycled independently. But you have to have a value chain that recognizes all these elements and has traceability and chain of custody, so that it gets recognized. And it's fascinating to see that work, that group working together, because BMW and Audi, they talk to each other a lot, but they've never been in a room together with Rexam, Tetra Pak, Nespresso or Rio Tinto, and it makes very interesting discussions. The last entry point is, how can we now go beyond these two entry points that I described earlier, that are more on a voluntary basis, to actually create a new level playing field, where it's the regulatory framework, the policy framework, and actually the financial world that changes. You heard from my bio, I'm a banker originally. I'm not an ecologist or bio expert. And I firmly believe that the finance community has done great work already in influencing business to integrate better biodiversity and nature conservation. The IFC Performance 6 standards is really what has driven a lot of change now in how business do look at new development projects, especially when they go close to critical habitats. And with the tools that we've developed, such as the integrated biodiversity assessment tool, in collaboration with our friends from BirdLife, we are now interacting directly, and they are using this information, the financial institutes are using this information. And next week, on Friday, I will be with the Cross-Sector Biodiversity Initiative, which is a fantastic initiative, which has on the one hand the International Council of Metals and Mining, so the big extractive companies, on the other hand IPCA, the oil and gas, and in the middle the Equator Bank the Equator Banks. And together they are actually discussing on how can we better implement the PF6 standards of IFC, and how actually can we be smarter in the investment and the financing of development projects, and making sure that we leave space for conservation action as well. So I'm very much looking forward to some of these discussions, and I firmly believe that if the financial sector gets it, then we might actually see a step change for the whole of the corporate community. Business Week just happened 2 weeks ago, and it was in the IUCN building, which is the picture you can see here on top. The wordle that you see at the bottom there are actually the words that were expressed by the participants at the end of that week, which is energized, motivated, and impressed, which is great. Because if we are able actually to foster that kind of relationship with business, that's fantastic. But I want to take your attention to is the collaborative initiatives. We spend a whole day actually discussing you business. What is it that you are interested to work on? And where do you think that IUCN or the conservation community at large can actually help you with? And these are the 5 items, the 4 items that came up. How can we scale up the net positive impact? And you might have heard through some various presentations already about net positive impact, but it's very much focused on the extractive industry. And we are willing to actually see and challenge to see, can that be applied beyond the extractive sector, and see if other sector can also introduce them. And the companies were even asking, and what about the net positive impact not only on biodiversity or on ecosystem services, but also on some of the social issues. So that's very interesting that business is actually quite progressive in that field. We were also asked to, can you help us with what we need to do if we want or if we are operating in key biodiversity areas? And I think we might be talking about some of the sessions in there later on today. So business are asking for that, but they're asking for what's the optimal regulatory framework that allows us then also to have the conservation activities in these areas. So this is something we're working with directly with our colleagues from our species program, and hopefully we'll come out with some suggestions there already before the end of this year. Landscape restoration is another item. As I told you on Monday, I was with these biotech companies. And this will create tension on land use, because there will be more and more resources that will be taken from biomass. And this will then create tension on food versus fuel versus new bioproducts. However, we have limited terrestrial land available to us, and not all of it is fertile at the moment. So clearly, if we focus on land restoration, then we probably will be able to foster and promote a bio-based economy, but also making sure that it doesn't create an adverse tension on the land that's currently being used for food and also energy in some cases. The last item that came up and business wanted to have more guidance on and wanted to contribute is accounting for natural capital. And actually, they also said social capital. So business has been very good at managing financial capital. Very good, well, I'm not sure, but at least that's what they've been focusing on for quite some time. Social capital is actually also a topic where they've concentrated a lot on how they treat their employees and how they better interact with the customer and the supplier base. But natural capital is this third capital that for the moment the companies haven't focused on. And together with the WBCSD and the Tea for Business Coalition, we are actually trying to look on how we can help that element to be taken. In the end, the whole week that we had in Business Week with 70 participants was very much about transformational change and how can the conservation community help in that journey, which will be a long and difficult journey, but actually get to real systemic changes and making sure that nature is at the center of that, because a lot of the inspiration of some of the changes and the new ideas are in that. So looking at time, I have to stop, but what I really wanted to highlight is that we started working on a bilateral basis with leading businesses and trying to get the best practices. After that, we said, well, these practices, it's great for one company, but we need to leverage that now at a sector level and actually with a whole range of companies so that the whole sector can actually be lifted up. But the third area of scaling up of our business engagement strategy will be if the public policy and the financial world helps us in making sure that it's not only the voluntary actions that gets rewarded and incentivized, but actually the whole system and also the SMEs are actually going to be influenced and change their way of interacting with nature. I will just leave this slide up for you, David, and for the further discussions on what our expectations are from CBD and the Global Partnership for Business. You are very well placed to be a network of networks, but we want to make sure it's with a purpose. And from my personal perspective, the purpose is very much linked to the CBD agenda. The IEC targets, the ABS protocol, and some of the workshops that were run through this last 2 days actually show that you've got, the leverage and the ability to do that. We also think that CBD could be a very good, or this global partnership could be a very good vehicle to ensure alignment between what's happening at the global level, regional level, and national level. We have that within IUCN as well. I'm head of the Global Business and Biodiversity. There are regional offices that are trying to have a regional effort, but then there are national committees having national engagements. And you can do things at the national level that you can't do on the global level. But let's make sure that there is alignment between all these efforts. And finally, CBD has a convening power which is quite immense. And hopefully together with IUCN, you can probably get some of the actors that are missing at the table. The negotiators, going back to the story of COP11, the regulators and the policymakers. I'm very glad to see that we have actually quite a few government representatives out here and in the various ministry, which is great. But where are the SMEs? They are not yet in this game and they are not around the table yet here. And there might be other underrepresented sectors. I'm missing the financial sector, for example, which is only very little represented in here. And then CBD with the IPES process are also identifying the gaps and the missing links. And that's where I see the opportunity for this global partnership to help with these things. So I just leave that for you for consideration in the rest of your deliberations. This is my last slide, and I had the 2-minute sign from Reg. Thank you for that. I just wanted to highlight that it's with these dialogues, these networking events, that will make progress, and we will go towards a better valuing of our natural capital. And actually, only in a month and a half time, in Edinburgh, in Scotland, there will be a World Forum on Natural Capital, and IUCN is very much involved in the organization of that. And we would welcome your participation out there. It's still open for registration at the moment, and actually some of the people that have been speaking during the last 2 days will also be there at that event. And we really want to see this as an opportunity for a debate. Let's put in all our concerns and also our aspiration and expectations on natural capital there at that event. The other large IUCN event that's coming up shortly after COP12 is World Parks Congress. And there really we're trying to come up with inspiring solutions, because World Parks Congress is only happening once every 10 years. So it's really one of these defining moments where suddenly there's whole new solutions, whole new agendas that can be built up. And we want to make sure that business is part of that exercise and is not excluded from the exercise like it might have been in Durban about 10 years ago. So we welcome for your participation, and not only financially. Please be sure that the actual involvement of business is extremely important on the content side, because we believe that there's a lot of tools, there's a lot of management practices that the conservation community can benefit from the business community. I'm going to stop here. I was a little bit over time, I'm sorry for that, but I hope you had some good information. Thank you.
We're going to take advantage of Gerard's presence to ask him some questions. I'll probably take 4 or 5 questions. I know we're close on time, but it's still important. And one thing Gerard forgot to mention, he said it's true that the Swiss like to be on time, but one thing that the Swiss like is numbers and guidebooks and data. So I would refer you to the IUCN site. There's a lot of documents that were produced in collaboration with Wholesome when Gerard was at Wholesome, and it's all available. It's for free and everything, and there's a lot of good information there. So go to the IUCN site. There's a lot of good information there. So questions? Okay.
My name is Yoshi Tatsugana. I work for Keitanden Committee on Nature Conservation, and thank you very much for your very impressive presentation as always. And my question relates to your very interesting note on the last slide, identify the gaps and missing links. I think that is very important from the business viewpoint as well as the nature conservation or biodiversity scientific viewpoint. It is clear that there are many things which business can do, but perhaps the areas which business can do does not cover the whole picture of biodiversity. Perhaps if the 100% of effort is done by the business, including SMEs, but there still remain some areas, missing areas, which the business can never do. And however, as an IUCN, what is your view on this? Are there any stakeholders, partners of IUCN covering that area which business can never touch?
Thank you, Yoshi, for that question. So just summarizing, if you didn't hear, is there are these missing gaps, missing links, but not all can be covered by business. So are there other partners or other parties that can help identifying some of these actions related to biodiversity can be taken on by others? Actually, what's happening right now, it's quite interesting for IUCN. We are getting requests from donors, so the traditional development agencies of the various countries, and most of them are actually European countries, but US aid as well. They are asking for, can you help us developing proposals, or can you make us a proposal on how we can actually activate activities at the landscape level with all the actors of society around the same table? And we are right now actually preparing a proposal for sub-Saharan Africa, and especially the economic growth corridors. And there we're actually trying to make sure that we take a horizontal view on the landscape. Because business are very good at looking at vertical views, you know, along their whole, your supply chain, and making sure that you're reducing your risk and getting your product, you know, in time, in the right conditions, at the best price into your operations. And that's a vertical view, if I may use that analogy. What we as the bird conservation community are very interested is in the horizontal view. How do we actually look at the landscape, at the water management that needs to be happening there, at the land use planning that needs to happen, and making sure that all the actors of society, business, but also the local communities, which are dependent sometimes on these natural resources, and actually are not part of the economic circuit, and then also a place for nature. So we are actually preparing proposals at the moment where we are saying, how do we then integrate business together with the policymakers, together with the local communities and the indigenous people, to come up with the optimal multifunctional landscape. And that way you're covering then the whole aspect of biodiversity at the landscape level. Now, this cannot be done on a global level because each context is so different. But if we do this on very specific patches, and probably the one where there is most tensions, like the economic growth corridors that you've got in some of the emerging markets, I think this will be a good way of tackling some of the issues we are facing.
Thanks very much, Gerald, for your good presentation. Certainly the CBD, as you mentioned, is well placed to mobilize the policymakers, the regulators. But some governments are maybe too cautious or unwilling to move forward, afraid of hurting the interests of business. So it would be good if they can hear from the business sector that yes, business is wishing to move forward and wishes to get better enabling environment from public policies. So it's a two-way process, and I would invite you to help us bring that message to the regulators, and let's make better use of the CBD for that. And I think COP12, we have agreed with the Korean government, as I mentioned, to have biodiversity for sustainable development as the motto. So that provides an opportunity for us to deal with this. Then you mentioned the issue of better integrated landscape planning and management. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there for more win-win solutions. Mm-hmm. And then there's this whole bigger process in New York following up on the Rio +20 conference. So the opportunities to design the way ahead for sustainable development agenda and how to incorporate more in the environment. And governments are a little lost in that discussion. So we have been receiving requests from our colleagues from the UN headquarters saying that governments need help from people that have the expertise on possible options on the way forward. So we have to find ways to bring to the government's attentions these options that we see. And again, the CBD can help as part of that. Certainly IUCN can also be promoting on its own this approach, and all of you, in fact. So I think that we have these good opportunities. Let's make the best use of these.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
So we're going to split the room again. The panel of standards is in